our community. It's like MindRL Hub. The goal of the community is to create a platform for researchers in the field of RL to exchange ideas and collaborate and help each other. We hope to enhance discussion and collaboration between peers in both RL from different fields, including neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and other disciplinary areas. The routine activity of this community includes but not limited to the research recap, where researchers introduce their own work, the journal jump, where researchers give a talk about a classical paper from other researchers, and the book breakdowns, where we read a book together, tutorial talk and tool times, researchers give tutorial to specific field or tools to lower the barrier of the modeling of human behaviors. So all this activity will be held online, so you can easily participate in via the Zoom link. So if you're interested in these activities, please see our GitHub for more info. And today we're going to have our third research recap and also the first English talk. So our speaker, Professor Stefano Palminteri, is that correct? Thank you.
Yes,
is the head director of the Laboratory de Neuroscience Cognitives and a computational analyst. So his research goal is to understand how humans learn to make decisions at the behavioral, computational, and the neural level. So his recent work focuses on the two computational hypotheses, relative value and learning biases. So according to the title, this must be what he's going to share with us today. So let's give the rest of time to Professor Palminteri.
Yeah.
So stop sharing.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction and invitation. I'm very happy to be here, and I really look forward to follow your initiative. It's a very important, for me, it's very rewarding to see, a community or young researcher gathering around the topic of the reinforcement learning that has always been, really the core of my research. I am already allowed to share my screen. Yeah, it appears so. Okay, I will now share my screen. I guess now you can see my screen and my slides, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, let me just minimize the chat. And if someone wants to ask a question during the talk, for me it's fine. Just unmute yourself and ask the question, or maybe we can have the question at the end, as you prefer. Okay.
For the question, I think it's better to save the question until the end because the time is limited and we want to have everything.
Okay. Let's do that. Yes. Okay. All right. So, in fact, very nice introduction. I will exactly talk about the two main line of research, or maybe I hope the two main contributions that I've given to the field so far. The talk is going to be organized first in a general introduction, in which I will give some general idea. We are going to do this very fast, but it's important to introduce some terms and some things. And finally, there will be two main parts. One is about relative value coding, and the other one about bias update, which correspond to confirmation bias. And then we're going to wrap up all this. Okay. As a general introduction, I work in reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning, it can capture a broad array of behavioral phenomena that goes from spatial navigation to very complex things. But the paradigm that I use in my research is the one of the bandit task. Okay, the bandit task is very simple. There are two different options, harm in the bandits, and the agent can pick one of these options and it enjoys a reward. Oftentimes in a laboratory, we talk about partial feedback, so we get only the reward of the outcome that we have chosen. In this case, the pink shape was associated with 10 points. We repeat this over many trials, etc. We can manipulate a lot of things. So, for example, in some experimental manipulation, we have complete feedback. So the agent, it's harder to do with rodents, but with humans, it's pretty easy. Can also be informed about the outcome of the counterfactual or unchosen option. But we will see we can manipulate the magnitude of the outcome, the number of options, etc., a lot of things. So it's a very simple experimental tool, but it's a very flexible one. Just to give you an idea, for example, this is one example taken from one of our studies in accelerated, several trials, choice, reward, etc., etc. So you can see that For example, in this case, it's a loss minimization task. The subject, after few trials, converge to the fact that the pink one is less punishing than the green one, and this is actually the case. But you can also see that the outcomes are probabilistic, so no symbol is perfect, okay? Just to give you an idea of the behavioral paradigm, okay? Now, moving forward, the typical results when you have this kind of tasks is taken from one of my first paper during my PhD. So I'm also very boring scientist, so I worked for much of my career on this kind of paradigm. You have these two options associated with different probability of gain. And the typical basic result is what we call the learning curve, okay? The learning curve, it's basically plotting the probability of choosing the best response. In that case, is this response here, because it's higher probability of gain, over trial. In this case, it's 24 trial. And the learning curve, the stereotypical feature, beginning a chance, then there is a negative acceleration, and then there is a plateau, okay? So the main behavioral variable we are interested in is choice in reinforcement learning, and specifically accuracy or the chance of maximize reward, okay? So this is how, then a box and arrow representation of the standard model of reinforcement learning. And it's important that we are on board on the standard model, because then you will see how we try to modify it. Okay, so the agent is the gray box here, is an environment which is represented by two options. These options are associated values that we call generally Q values because of the term quality, is the quality of the option. These Q values are fed in a function that generates a response probability. The standard function that we are going to use is the softmax. And then this choice probability translates into action. Action, you get a reward, in this case, 10 points. And after this, you have the calculation of a prediction error, which is very important. So it's the difference between the obtained and the predicted reward. It is also a measure of the ship price. And then the prediction error is translated into a Q value. It updates the Q value following a delta rule. And in that case, the key parameter is alpha, it is the learning rate, okay? So that's the standard model. Now, let me introduce another important concept for me, which is the concept of cognitive bias, okay? And I will give you a definition that is really information processing oriented definition. Because often when you talk about cognitive bias, is something that is negative, it's negative for the cognition of the agent. No, I have, my proposition is that we should go deeper at the level of a more quantitative and more, objective definition. So if you take essentially a cognitive process, in many cases, it's the translation of an objective variable into a subjective value, okay? So for example, in perception, you see that there is some sort of photonic stimulation. It is transformed into a valuation that corresponds to luminosity, color, and stuff. We could suppose that in theory, the process is noiseless, so there is no noise and there is no bias. In that case, you will have a not only monotonic, but also linear relationship between the objective value and the subjective value, okay? Of course, this is already unrealistic. So we know that the brain will contain also, some inherent noise process. So we already know that the bias, the process is going to be noisy, but this is still a situation in which there is no bias, because it is true that there are fluctuations, but the fluctuations are random around the mean. A bias process is something like that, in which there is still a relationship that is fairly good, monotonic between the objective and the subjective value. Nonetheless, there are systematic deviations. For example, here an overestimation, here an underestimation. So based on this graph, my definition of a bias is a feature of a cognitive process that introduces systematic distortion between an objective variable and the state of the world, which is the state of the world, and the subjective representation of it. And we will see a bias is not necessarily good and bad. It depends on the situation. So now, if we translate this notion of bias to the box and arrow model that I show you, we can imagine that in the reinforcement learning scenario that here I simplify, right? I get rid of all the equation for a moment. We could have two possible places for having biases. The first, in which I'm interested in, is this notion of epistemic bias. So it's biases that are at the interface between outcome encoding and the knowledge or the value of the subject. And I call them epistemic because episteme in ancient Greek means knowledge. You can also have other sort of bias that are, for example, the interface between the values and the action, which will not be my main focus. So now, if you come back to the complex model and you ask where we can find epistemic bias here, it's essentially in two places here. Because as I said, an epistemic bias is a bias of the construction of the Q values. We have said already that the construction of the Q values is done in two steps, the prediction error calculation step and the update step. So we are going to see biases in these two equations. Okay. Right. The last point of introduction is that in general, in psychology, we are interested in descriptive models. So we start from the behavior and we want to find which is the best model that accounts for the data. For doing so, we leverage on data, experiment, fitting, simulation, etc., etc. And this is the descriptive approach. In this paper, in this presentation, I will give you also some nuggets, some information about the normative status of the model, which is different. The question asked is different. It's which model generates a higher performance? And this is done with ideas, theory, simulation. And in a way, it is also an intermediate step that allows bridging psychology with artificial intelligence, because in artificial intelligence, the researchers are really concerned about the performance of the model, not about whether the model is like humans. While we in psychology, we're generally more interested about whether the performance is the model is a good replication of the human performance. Okay, so the first chapter is about relative value encoding. Here, I'm putting the reference of a review, a short review that summarizes the state of the art of this research, of this notion of context-dependent or relative valuation, up to 2022, I guess. Even if I will present also some results published later, done in collaboration with my laboratory. Okay, so a big question that I asked in my research concerned contextual influence in judgment evaluation. Okay, so we know that it's well established, for example, in perception, but also in behavioral economics, that judgments are strongly affected by the context. So this optical illusion is the prime example. Even if we know at the intellectual level, we know that the size of the orange circle is the same, we have the impression that one is bigger than the other one because of the surroundings. The same is also true with more high level, you can say, economic decision making, right? So this is a famous example of a decoy effect, okay? So if you have to choose, for example, between two wines at 10 and 30 pounds, you're going to reject the 30 pounds options because you perceive like the very expensive. But then you had a decoy, a third option, which is even more expensive, 50 pounds. And now the mid option becomes reasonable. A big question that essentially I asked in my research is, does whether or not similar distortions also apply to the representation of reward in the context dependent, in the reinforcement level, okay? So essentially, if you came back to the equation, it boils down to change this equation by supposing that the prediction error is not calculated via the difference of the objective rewards minus the Q value, but there is this notion of subjective reward in which the reward is distorted in a way that takes into account the context, essentially. Just to give you a little bit of history about this idea, as I said, it has been, for example, proposed in psychophysics by Helston. The notion of adaptation level says that perception of a stimulus depends on the average value of the stimulus in a given context. This model has been later refined by Allen Partucci by proposing that actually the subjective valuation of a stimulus depends on the range. Then a similar idea is also to be found in a notion of incentive relativity in the behaviorism line of research, in which the subjective value of outcome also depends on the essentially its contextual value. In that case, it's very similar than Helston formulation. So when you translate essentially this idea to our context, to our reinforcement learning framework, you can, for example, conceptualize two things. One process is called reference point dependence. So you suppose the objective reward is actually the the subjective reward is actually the objective one minus a reference point that tries to track the average value of the outcome in a given situation. Or you can have some form of range adaptation in which we now think this rule is the best approximation, actually, in which you suppose that the subjective reward is a function of the objective reward, but normalized by the range, and the range is basically keeping in mind what is the maximum and the minimum possible outcome. Okay. Now, how we have demonstrated this? Okay, so here I'm plotting results for a paper which has been published in 2021. It's a bit more complex, but to do simple, there are essentially two contexts. One with a big magnitude context in which the subject is choose between a high reward big magnitude and a high probability big magnitude and a low probability big magnitude. And then there is also small magnitude context. Okay, so the subjects are exposed several times with this context separately. Okay, so the big magnitude and small magnitude. As you can see, the probabilistic difference is the same, but the magnitude of the outcome is not the same. So we can first plot accuracy during the learning phase after several trials, I guess 24 or 30, something like that. In this condition, A, B, and C, D, the subjects are above chance. So it verifies learning. So if there were a chance, accuracy would be here, but you can see that in average, they are above chance. There is also an effect of magnitudes, which is not huge, but significant. So now what we do, and that's really a key idea of a lot of my experiments, we create a new transfer test in which we now propose to the subject a different choice. So essentially, we mix up options that were never presented together. Of particular importance here is this one, right? Because it is essentially comparing this option, 10 points, 25%, which this option, 1 point, 75%. Now, if you look at the rational choice, so the choice that maximizes the points, of course, this option here is the rational choice because the expected value of this option is higher. Interestingly, if you think about the possibility of context dependence, it could be the case that this preference is different. So let's see what are the results. So as you can see in this AD, there is no surprise. Subject choose the maximizing option. Okay, so they are very well above chance. It also shows that subjects can actually extrapolate. So they are not learning pure policy here. They are learning value that are associated to the individual option. It can be extrapolated to new context. But crucially, when you look at the performance in this key situation, performance is not even random, is significantly below chance. So in that case, they are choosing with higher rate the suboptimal option. And we think the interpretation is that this one, okay, so, and now if you plot a standard model, a standard Q-learning without any deformation in red, you will see two things in the behavior. So first of all, a model with unbiased value will predict a huge magnitude effect in the learning phase, as you can see here on the left. On the other side, the same model will also predict a very good accuracy. I mean, very good, a good accuracy or above chance performance in the transfer phase, okay? But now this model is clearly, so the standard model is clearly falsified by this data. And we propose a model with range adapted value, in which there is a form of normalization, which manages to both capture the perfect size of the magnitude effect during the learning phase, but also a value significant suboptimality in the transfer phase. Why? Because the model now is keeping in mind not absolute value, but context-dependent value. And since these options here were contextually correct during the learning phase, while this option here were contextually incorrect, the subject presented with this new choice will pick significantly this one, okay? So now let's see with a toy example and to also what is happening here, okay? Here, I'm trying to plotting the objective value of the options as a function of the subjective value, okay? It's the option as before, A, B, C, D, and the points represent the magnitude, could be, it's arbitrary in this case, okay? So if you have an objective representation, you will transform this value linearly in this value. So you can see that this unbiased representation has some cost, is the fact that the accuracy now in the small magnitude context. It's very small, but it has also some benefit, is that now this model correctly rank B and C. So if it is presented with new choice between B and C, it will make the right choice. Now let's see what's happening with the range adapted values. Okay, so in the range adaptation basically consists in adapting the slope of the transformation between the objective and the suggested value in a context-dependent manner. So this is the slope for the big magnitude context, and now this is the slope for the small magnitude context. There has been a range adaptation, so adaptation and slope. So now you can see that there is a significant distortion in the subjective values. And again, we can identify bad and good thing. The bad thing is now there is not the correct ranking between C and B, okay? So now you can see that the subjective representation is such the subject think that C is better than B. On the other side, the good thing is that there is a correct, high accuracy in the small magnitude context. And it is precisely on this direction that we are starting exploring the normative side of value normalization. Okay, we'll come back on this in a second. Now I will show you the latest published results in our team. It has been published on eLife, in which we try also to super characterize the functional form of normalization, because in the study that I showed you, the data were very well explained by a very simple model in which the normalization was just a division essentially by the max. Because of the construction of the task, we could not really tease apart two alternative and also equally plausible hypotheses about range normalization. One about normalization. So one is range adaptation. It's the equation I already showed you before, and the other one is device normalization. That is very popular in neuroscience. By the way, both equations are historical precedents in behavioral science, such as the matching law for device normalization, or as I showed you, range frequency theory. So now, what is the design that is perfectly suited to tease apart these two equations, range adaptation and device normalization? It is a contrast between choice set with two or the number of options, okay? Because now, as you can see, for example, this is the choice set one with a battle of 3, 5, and 1. And this is the second one with 5 and 1. If you're applying device normalization, typically you can see that the value of the battle that it is worth 5 euros is 0 and 1, etc. Because the normalization process here only takes into account the two extremes, that in that case would be the 1 and the 5. Now, when you see what happens in the device normalization, since the key idea of device normalization is to divide by all the possible rewards, you can see that the same battle here, 5, will have quite different values if it was presented in a choice set with one option and two options. Okay, we translated this idea in the reinforcement learning scenario, and we had a design in which we manipulated the range. So we have wide range for 86 to 14 points. And we also manipulated the number of options, and small range from 50 to 14, but we also manipulate whether the task contained 3 or 2 options. So now you can see that if you plot the subjective values after learning of the options as a function of different models, you will have quite different patterns, okay? So the unbiased model will just follow the objective value of the options, and will do something like that. The divisive model, it will reduce the difference between the narrow and the wide context. Nonetheless, it will also create a choice set effect. So all things being equal, the option associated with 50 with only 2 options is perceived as bigger than an option that was associated to 50 when there were 3 options. The range model doesn't care, essentially, and will predict similar values for everything, okay? So we ran the experiment, and long story short, the data were strongly in favor of the range model compared to the other 2 accounts, okay? Now, just to come back briefly on the brain, this talk is gonna be mainly a behavioral talk. What about the brain? So indeed, there is a very strong precedent to suppose that some form of range normalization is also operating at the level of the brain. notably since Tremblay and Schulz in the 90s, but also Kobayashi and also Paolo later, they all have found significant sign of range normalization in neural activity, thus proposing that suggesting that the behavioral model that we validate on choice-based data only is also valid at the neural level. Okay. Okay. Finally, I wanted to comment a little bit on what could be the normative value, the adaptive value of this range normalization. So as I said, there is a distortion. This is exactly the same scheme as before. And the positive side is essentially that if you assume that the decision as we think are based on a softmax, if you do some sort of range normalization, you will be able to maximize accuracy, actually even better, I think the term regularize accuracy across a broad range of outcome values. Okay. So for those that are more familiar with the debate in machine learning, what is the proposition that we are making in this work in progress is that range normalization is essentially a way to achieve scale-independent performance in the algorithm. And we have done and verified so by running extensive simulation in which we manipulate two important features of the task, the magnitude and the difficulty. So the magnitude is whether the outcomes are the same or much bigger, etc. And the difficulty is how close are the two outcomes. And we suppose range normalization or not. And assuming, of course, a fixed softmax temperature, you can see the standard model as a function of the difficulty or the difficulty or as a function of the magnitude will have performance that peak at a certain point. On the other side, a range adaptive model will have performance that are quite stable, so it achieves scale independent, scale invariant performance. So we think this is the adaptive value of range normalization. By the way, just there is a preprint about even some mathematical demonstration about this. Okay, so this is the end of the first part. Reinforcement learning that makes you smart and happy. Why? Is a form of adaptive coding. And at the subjective level, thanks to range adaptation, in some contexts, negative outcome become positive and small magnitude become big. So it motivates you to work well or in situation in which the outcomes are not necessarily so great. Let's move to biased update. Again, there is a review with my friend, Maile Breton, that summarizes our understanding of this topic in what we believe is an exhaustive method that you see. So we started, I started working on this topic because, you know, I knew that from psychology and stuff, there's a lot of talking about different biases, negativity biases, optimistic biases, positivity bias, overconfidence, confirmation bias, etc. That has always been studied with very high level tasks. And I wanted to see whether we could find similar things also in low level problems. Okay, so now we move to test these biases in the reinforcement learning scenario, and more specifically in the scenario of the bandits. It boils down to now modify the update rule and suppose that there is not only one learning rate, but the learning rate is conditional to the valence or the sign of the prediction error. Okay, so the prediction error can be good news, bad news, positive or negative, right? And if you, so essentially, you can see whether the two learning rates are similar or not. The first study in which we have done that was published in 2017. Again, with a bandit with different conditions. We fitted in these bandits the learning rate. In the first experiment, subjects were playing with rewards of neutral. We fitted this model with two learning rates, and we found that the learning rate for positive prediction error was lower compared to the prediction error, the learning rate for the negative one. Okay. So the first experiment, we thought, okay, maybe this is because just 0 is not a strong motivator, but if you had negative, you will reverse the effect. So we ran a replication in a fully incentivized manner in an economics department, etc., and we replicate the effect. Okay, so this is the first behavioral computational evidence that there is a positivity bias. Now, across several papers, several studies, etc., I will just recap what are the behavioral signature of a positivity bias that we identified. So for example, when we have a stable task in which the two options are the same, so the subject has to discover, so doesn't know, But in this case, there is no good response because both options are associated with the same level of reward and stuff. You simulate the model, you realize that a model with a positivity bias, so a model that is more sensitive to positive prediction error, will hallucinate, will create, believe that there is a correct response rate, and will develop a preferred response much more than all the other models. You can also have different kind of tasks in which at some point after a few trials, there is a reversal. And in the last trial, what was the good response become the bad response, and what was the bad response become the good response. In this case, you can see that the positivity bias model only will perseverate, will have trouble in changing the good response. This will become important later. You can also see that here, for example, the model has a very good performance. Finally, you can have also the other kinds of tasks in which, in this case, the outcomes are, there is, for example, a safe options, sort of a risk task, which the here is associated with a 0 with probability of 1, and there is a risky option. You can see that only the positivity bias can generate risk seeking. This signature has been found here as shown in simulation, but they've been found several times in the literature. In the paper, in the TICS paper, we also review evidence for different things. So, for example, people have tested the positivity bias in stable and volatile environment, and they replicate this effect. This is done with appetitive rewards, money, but you have the same with electric shock. So aversive primary rewards. Other people have tested this in other species, for example, monkey and rats, and of course with differences, but interestingly, the results seem to be replicated also across a broad range of species. So it doesn't seem to be a specific feature of humans and not a specific feature of high-level belief update. So essentially, in a simplified way, this is what is saying the model, right? That as a function of the prediction error, the update is the difference between the new Q value and the old Q value. Follow this slope with a bigger slope in the positive compared to the negative domain. And as I said, it can explain status quo bias, gambling, for example, but also overconfidence because the subjective probability of being correct, it is perceived as being higher. We actually have a paper in Psychological Review recently published to link this bias to confidence, and we can talk about this later, right? What about the brain? So first of all, very prominent and influential model of, sorry, there is no citation here, is Michael Frank 2004 science paper, but in general is a very popular model of the basal ganglia frontal cortex secret that via the fact there are two pathways and two different neurodopaminergic modulation already allow for the system to have two different and independently modulable learning rates. Ourselves, we have investigated the neural correlates of the optimistic update in subjects with a relatively large cohort, 50 subjects for fMRI, and found that, for example, people with higher optimistic bias have a higher response in the striatum, thus providing a correlation between the brain and cognitive reinforcement learning bias. We also explored this effect in pathology, and in this recent paper that we published in Psychological Medicine, that we saw that while we replicate the classic results in control subjects, so a positivity bias, the effect was reversed in patients with depression, which is also being confirmed in a computational meta-analysis, thus suggesting that probably there is a common psychological trait in depression and anxiety that is a higher sensitivity to punishment. So this kind of research can also be used and interesting for psychiatric research. Now, it is important to note that not everybody agree with me, and there is also proliferation of studies that reanalyze my data, because in the lab we are also very, very keen to share the data. And for example, there has been several publications to propose alternative interpretation of the behavior than the positivity bias. And I think the more interesting one came from Japan, from Kentaro Katahira, who proposed that actually an explicit perseveration model could be a good explanation of the data, an alternative to the confirmation bias. The perseveration model works like that, okay? So here in green is what I already explained to you: action, outcome, update to learning rate, etc. The gradual perseveration model, which can be conceived as a sort of habit formation model, suppose that the simple fact of choice going to increment a choice trait that bias the selection. Okay, so here is the equation for the update. All good. And here are the equation for the perseveration model. So here the choice trait, it is incremented every time that an option is chosen. It is reduced every time that an option is not chosen. So you can see this choice trait really as an habit trait. And then inside the softmax, you can see the same softmax is actually not only weighting the Q values, but is weighting also the Q values and the perseveration parameter. Okay. Now, what Kentaro Kataira has shown in a first simulation study is that indeed, if you simulate a model with perseveration, but without positivity bias, and then you fit the model by not taking into account perseveration, like here and here, you will end up by generating an artificial perseveration bias. And you can see why, because a lot of the behavioral signature that I show you as associated with the positivity bias could in principle also derive from just simple choice repetition bias, okay? Because stickiness, inertia, problem in reversal, etc., are in a way form of repetition bias. So what I've done is that I've taken 10 or 9 data sets from us, but also from Kataira Lab, and I wanted to do a computational meta-analysis. So basically, I fit the perseveration and the bias across all these studies. So here, the letters here corresponds to different studies, except the last column that is an average across studies. So this is the meta-analytical p-value, and each dot is a subject in a study. So indeed, it is true that when you fit this full model, in each study, in average, you find a significant repetition term, because the phi parameters, which is the impact of the choice trace into choice, could be negative, could be 0, but it is indeed positive. So it is in the sense of the repetition. But crucially, you also fit the 2 different learning rates and you plot them as a function of the study. You can see that also the 2 different learning rates are found with an asymmetric value. Specifically, if you follow the blue dots, they are above 0. And this is the difference between the positive or the negative learning rate. But in that case, we call it confirmatory and disconfirmatory. So 2 biases seems to coexist in the task, even though I still have doubt for the perseveration one, but you can read the discussion, the very long discussion in this paper if you're curious about it. So both biases are detectable. But now also here we are going to ask the question of what do we know of the normative value of these biases. And concerning the perseveration bias, there has been several studies. Concerning the confirmation bias, sorry, there's been several studies, including one by Germain Lefebvre and collaborator, that show that it can be optimal. Nonetheless, all these previous studies only didn't investigate what we believe a more interesting situation, so meaning the partial feedback situation, and also comparing with the perseveration or the choice repetition parameter. So what we do to do that? We devised evolutionary simulation, okay? So we started with the 1,000 agents characterized by a genotype, you can say, composed by the 5 parameters of the model, and they played all different banding tasks. And the idea is that in the transition between after each generation, I rank the performance of the agent. The worst 5% die, the remaining 90% replicate, and the best replicate twice, okay? So you can see that now there is a bonus in the fitness as a function of the performance. We replicate it several times across 200 generations, and we also introduce variability into different ways. So in one case, we introduce variability via mutation, essentially. So we start with a fixed value of parameter, and then we introduce variability. And in another situation, just to check, to explore better the data, we introduce variability by starting with a uniform distribution of the parameter, and then we narrow down by the cull of the unfit, the population, okay? So let's see if the algorithm is working. yes, because across 200 generations, you can see that the fitness function improve. They start a chance, and then the population get enriched in good performance, and then it seems to be a plateau. Now, you can see what's happening to the different biases. So in average, you can see that the perseveration is selected. And here, each gray line corresponds to one evolutionary simulation, and the black line is the average. 0 would be no perseveration, negative value anti-perseveration. So you can see that it is in average selected, even though it's on variability. And now let's see what happens to the learning biases. The learning biases are also the positivity biases, more specifically, it's systematically selected. Okay, so you can see that in all 100 evolutionary simulation that I run, the biases are systematically selected over the 200 generations. So both gradual perseveration and positivity bias emerge, but the latter is more robust. Okay. You can also check the stability of the results with different initialization points. Okay. So this is, for example, I started with 0 value for all the parameters. In this space, it's alpha plus, alpha minus. So you can see that the subject the simulation converges to a positivity bias, because here it's the space of the quadrant where the alpha plus is bigger than alpha minus. We tried the same thing by starting here. Interesting, here you can see that the learning rate converge here, while in that case, there is almost no selection of the perseveration parameter. Here, we start with a positivity perseveration parameter and with a positivity bias. You can see that it's also selected. So actually, you can see how stable is the point of convergence, while the perseveration is reduced by half. And finally, when you start with a positivity bias and non-perseveration, you have no perseveration at all that is selected, and the population stay well in the positivity domain. Okay. So we can get this similar conclusion across a different initialization, more or less. Also, basically, positivity bias is more evolutionary stable than perseveration. Just briefly, why do you think that the positivity bias or the confirmation bias is selected? Because when it is not too big, so this is a simulation as a function of different bias, no bias, a moderate bias, and an extreme bias. You can see that the extreme confirmation, so if you look at the convergence, only when there is no bias, you converge to a good representation of the task, while in case of the bias, you will exceed this representation. However, when you see the accuracy, and this is very important, we are going to see something. So this is the knowledge of the model. So this is the epistemic accuracy of the model, and this is the instrumental accuracy of the model. Okay. So the accuracy. So you can see that the highest accuracy is not achieved by the unbiased model, but is achieved by a model that has a confirmation bias that is at least moderate. And here, really high the fact that the wrong knowledge, so hallucinate a little bit on the Q values, could be achieved, could give good performance. And essentially, what is doing this confirmation bias, that it amplifies the correct response value, and it is a form of noise cancellation. So to conclude this part, and then we are almost done, the bias update essentially make you smart and happy because it helps you neglect irrelevant negative information. It is essentially an overestimation of one probability of success, so it's also subject to be positive. Okay, let's come to the conclusion very quickly. The first conclusion is that coming linked to the normative studies, that the epistemic accuracy, so being accurate at the level of the knowledge, does not imply instrumental accuracy. So you can be wrong, overestimate a value, normalize a value, and still perform well, even better than you were right in terms of knowledge. And this is very important consequences for the great rationality debate. The second conclusion is that similar biases for high-level and low-level process exist. So you don't have to look for, by seeking parsimony, you don't have to look to complex explanation for cognitive biases, as they also pervade simple reinforcement learning. And this is also important for translational research, right? In the sense that we can show that we can study the same stuff in animals. Second point, can brain data help computational cognitive science? on this point of view, I am a little bit skeptic, right? In a sense, it is true that, by inferring a choice from model from the choice, we do a sort of direct inference. But I think that at the level of behavioral description, the brain is not necessarily something fundamental to understand. It is important to keep in mind that the different explanations of behavior are separated. And actually, as a matter of fact, it is also important that you get rid of this brain metaphor. You can also easily translate this information to some extent, even to artificial intelligence research. Okay, finally, I wanted to thank my source of funding, but also the team and also the alumni and collaborators that contributed to your study. And thank you very much for your attention and for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Palminteri. So now you can unmute yourself and ask whatever question you want to Professor. So anyone want to ask a question?
I can see there is something in the chat. There is one question, I guess, in the chat, maybe. Foundational psychology, we often use a chat condition as a control group. And we may have certain biases in how we treat the chance condition ambiguity. Sometimes process.
So would you mind open your mic, unmute yourself, and then ask the questions?
So yeah, I think the question in the chat is more how to tease apart the ambiguity, and I think it is true. So that one of big part of my research is also about to make understand that indeed, for example, a neutral outcome, it is ambiguous because it's highly context dependent, right? So experimentally, I think the only way which you can actually really tease apart this confusion between what is the balance of an outcome is to systematically run different experiments in which you modify the value of the outcomes and are therefore capable to assess that the results, for example, go always in the predicted direction. An example is, for example, when I think the question maybe came after, but when I show you that, for example, the positivity bias, we can replicate it with positive and neutral outcome, but also with two different kind of negative outcomes, etc., etc. It shows you that even when you modify the range of the possible outcome, you still find the same result. So I think it resolves a little bit this ambiguity in a way.
I want to ask a question. It's like, I really like your normalized value in the first sections because you shows that there is a behavioral hallmark and according to that behavioral hallmark, we know that the normalized value exists in human mind. But in the second one, you use the modeling method or quantitative method to show that the confirmation bias exists. Do you know any like behavioral evidence to support that claim? Because I know this kind of a statement has been made a long time, but few behavioral hallmark has been provided to support that.
You mean to support what? The fact that both biases coexist? Because
yes.
Yeah, I mean,
yes, a near behavioral method to show that they exist in the human mind.
But yeah, so from the indeed, I mean, I don't think that the two things are two parallel things, right? So it's just that historically, based on the design that we've done, we started with two different set of paradigms that are well better suited to highlight the behavioral signature or either of the value normalization side or on the other side on the confirmation bias. But indeed, we are converging to a more integrated model that takes into account on both features, right? And it is also very important to test this because, again, to some extent, the two effects overlap because two different computational mechanisms, but they both improve accuracy by in a way adjusting the transformation between the objective value and choices. So it is important that the two are not really, that one does not disappear if you take into account it. And then, for example, the paper I briefly mentioned, which is also about confidence, which is published in Psychological Review in 2003, it does show that you can detect both confirmation and normalization in the same task, in the same data set. So they seem to be two both present independent processes.
Another question.
Yeah. Hi, Professor. So thank you for your presentation. Very impressive. I noticed that for most of your research, you focus on give people different magnitude of rewards. So I'm curious, let's say if you only give people different magnitudes of punishment, will you observe the similar behavior patterns or brain activation patterns?
Yes, let me show you something, because again, for simplicity, I didn't show exactly all the study. But for example, in this one, we merged the two features, which was modulation essentially of the magnitude, and also modulation of the valence in the same one. Okay, you can see my screen, I guess, now again, right?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Great. So here, as you can see, we have big magnitudes in the positive domain, and also, big and small magnitude in the positive domain, and also big and small magnitude in the negative domain. Okay, so we manipulated magnitude also in the punishment. And again, when you look at the subjective evaluation of the outcome here, this is the pattern that you observe. So you can see that you have range normalization essentially also across the negative domain, right? So it's not something that seems to be specific of the game. It's actually the same model pretty well explained the fact that you have a normalization process in both reward and punishment. Now, it is true that we have less systematically investigated magnitude effect in the punishment domain. There is only one study, this one with 2 experiments. And I'm open to the possibility that if we do this with more subjects, more power, we can detect some asymmetries. We know from other field of research, prospect theory, that there are different perception of the magnitude of positive and negative outcomes. So it could be that if you give more power, you will find some effects that are not symmetrical. But at least if I give you the results just roughly 50 subjects, you will find a pattern that it's consistent in both domains, essentially.
Okay, I see. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think the meeting is last for almost 1 hour. And if there are no questions, maybe this ends Professor Palminteri again. And we, oh, there's another question. Type some questions.
Okay, you mind type some answer about how to code the value of ambiguity in the chat? I can't hear clearly, sorry. Okay. So I guess, I mean, the answer to this it really depends on the definition that the person in the chat is considering of ambiguity, because in this model that I'm using, there is no an explicit term for ambiguity, essentially, right? So the ambiguity is the fact that the symbol, first of all, it's ambiguous, so will not tell you whether the value of what is the value of the symbol. So there is no explicit description. So this is one source of ambiguity. And then the other source of ambiguity is the fact that all options are probabilistic. So you will never be absolute certain about the probabilistic outcome. But to be honest, I could not really write a way in which the model take into account ambiguity, because there is no explicit term of ambiguity in the model. Maybe I can write it to the person. Sorry. Yeah.
So I think we should end the meeting right now, and that's it. Thanks, Professor Palminteri, again for coming here.
Sure. Thank you to you, and yeah,
Thank
good luck
you.
with your initiative. And you know, if you
Thank you
need
very
some
much.
other resources such as the papers on the code of the data, they can be found more or less in a publication. But ask me if something is not here. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye. Ciao.
Bye.